Hey there everybody, welcome back. So in this video we're going to be talking about the public sector or the government sector and its role in the macroeconomy. In this we'll be sort of working on two fronts. The first is the role of the government as a maker of rules and therefore the platform on which economic activity is essentially constructed. And then second, the government as a fiscal agent, that is as a consumer of goods and services, and then also a taxer, a taxing entity. Now, on the first of those fronts, the government is a maker of a rule. In the United States in 2020, which is where I'm speaking you from, the United States, of course, is a representative democracy, right, a republic. And that means that we, as citizens within this country, have the right to elect representatives on our behalf to make the rules that we all live by, right? So if we don't like the rules that we currently have, we can send people to government to change those rules. And in this way, we're able to create the sort of framework around which our economy is built. So, for example, we might decide that certain types of production are too destructive to people's health, and so we make a rule saying, you can't do that. And so, of course, production changes. So in this way, the government, essentially through our government, tells us, what can be done, what should be done, what must be done, what cannot be done, what should not be done, and what must not be done. So law and sort of the softer elements of that, so social morals, standards of behavior, are all determining how we're going to do this thing called economy. How am I going to look for a job? What are the things that the business can ask me when they're interviewing me? What can't they ask me? Okay. What's the structure of my workplace going to look like when I go to work? Okay. At all times throughout our daily economic lives, in virtually every interaction and transaction we have, the sort of rules and structure of society is determining the shape that interaction will take. Therefore, when we consider sort of the role of the state and we think about the government, we can see that it is foundational, right? You can see that our preferences about how things should or should not be become foundational to everything economic. So we think of the economic questions from the very beginning of the course: what to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce. These become social questions. They're always social questions. So we create this, we're constantly recreating social structure around economic activity. And that social structure is a reflection of our values as a society. Okay? And they're dynamic. They change over time. What we consider to be an appropriate way to produce things at one point in time becomes inappropriate. And what was inappropriate can become appropriate. Some examples. Now, we can see from this that, generally speaking, most of us, I think, would say that these are all good changes, right? That things are getting better. But of course, not everybody agrees with every change that is ever made. That's part of the the organization of society. Anytime you get together with a group of individuals, there's going to be disagreements about what should be done and how it should be done. Think about last time you got together with friends and ordered a pizza. Maybe you disagreed about the toppings that should be on the pizza. Maybe you disagreed about where you should order the pizza from. Maybe you disagreed on the type of crust you should have. Indeed, it's almost certain that whatever you ended up with didn't please everybody perfectly. But there was a process, hopefully, where everybody was able to have some input about what you were going to do as a collective group. So now that we understand that really the entire economy is instituted by society through the legal structure and social norms, we can move on to talking about the government as a consumer of goods and services and is a taxing entity. Okay. Of course, the government is a significant consumer of goods and services in the United States in 2020. And we just the list here, right? Okay, now how does the government do that? Well, when the government spends U.S. dollars, so right now, actually, as we speak, we're embroiled in sort of another question of stimulus, right? Are we going to spend on stimulus to fight this pandemic we're all in at the moment? Now, when the government spends, it spends U.S. dollars, of course, and it spends those from its account at the Fed. Now, the Fed is the central bank of the United States and was covered in depth in an earlier video. If their spending threatens to run the account into deficit, they can sell treasury bonds. So this is federal government debt. Okay, so these sales of treasury bonds are conducted by the central bank. And in fact, the central bank has to facilitate these as a matter of law, right? So, the federal government wants to spend more money. The Fed can't say, well, we're just not going to sell treasury bonds. It's not, not a thing they can do. Okay. So the federal government can sell treasury bonds, which are an IOU from the Treasury to the public. Right. Now, it's worth noting that the Fed cannot buy these treasuries directly from the federal government. Okay. However, because the Fed essentially has to run treasury sales if it has to do so, that the federal government can never run out of U.S. dollars. Okay. Because it can always issue more treasury debt effectively ad infinitum. The federal government can effectively never run out of U.S. dollars unless it chooses to do so. Okay, so a lot of times you hear people say things like, well, the federal government is bankrupt, or we just don't have any more dollars to spend. This is always incorrect. The federal government can always spend more, but we may choose not to spend more as a society. Just like you or me might say, well, we're not spending any more on that. Now, effectively, the federal government is spending this money into existence, and for that reason, we refer to this as an injection in economics. So it's an injection of expenditure because it's an expenditure for which there's no immediate correspondent. It's not from any immediately correspondent income. In other words, the federal government can spend this money without having any money effectively. We can see this idea represented in our little model. And here, the bottom line here below is our model that we've sort of been building throughout the semester. Notice we have a category G that represents government spending, which is injected into the economy. Okay. On the other side of the coin, there are taxes. Right? When government collects taxes, we call this a leakage. Okay? And the reason why we call it a leakage is because they represent incomes, right? I earned the money that I pay in taxes just like you did too, but there's not going to be any correspondent expenditure. I can't spend my taxes. You can't spend them either. Nobody can spend their taxes. So it's an income with no expenditure, called a leakage. Now, if injections are effectively the beginnings of money, so when the federal government's spending, it's spending that money into existence, taxes are the end of money. Okay, so when the government collects taxes, that's effectively the end of that money. Now, this may seem strange, right? You may say, wait a second, doesn't the government have to sort of collect taxes and then spend? No. Okay. In fact, it's the other way around. To understand this, think again what we talked about in the last presentation. In that presentation, we talked about how money is debt, okay, and that money, our money, U.S. dollars, is the debt of the Federal Reserve, which they're able to issue indirectly through the U.S. Treasury. So what is a U.S. dollar? Well, it's not exactly an IOU from the federal government, but it's an indirect IOU from the U.S. federal government. All right, now when you issue an IOU, let's say you owe your friend some lunch or whatever. Like your friend takes you out to lunch and you're like, hey, I owe you next time. It's on me. You've effectively issued them an IOU. Let's say you write it down on paper. I owe you one lunch, right? Okay. You issue that IOU, okay, and then a month later you pay up, right? You're like, you tell your friend, like, hey, you give me that IOU back now because I don't owe you lunch anymore. All right. When you collect the IOU that you issued back, you destroy it, right? Tear it up. Okay, it's done. I'm going to forget about it. it's at the initial point when you created the IOU that it came into existence. And of course, when it was redeemed, it was destroyed, right? Okay, so when the federal government spends, it's creating IOUs, and when it taxes, it's destroying those IOUs. Okay, so the government spending is the beginning of money indirectly, and taxation is the end of money. All right, let's take then what we've learned and sort of plop it down into our little model that we've been developing throughout this term. Okay, let's assume to get started that households earned $1,000, as it states here, in a given time period. So Y is going to initially equal 1,000. Let's assume that they have 250 in required spending as autonomous spending. They have additional $400 in desired spending. Okay, you can read all this out right here, right? Which is going to make our consumption function look like the one below, including a tax bill, which we didn't include before, but now we're going to include. Okay, so let's take all those givens that we've just talked about and let's solve this consumption function out. Okay, well, when we do that, we get this number 650. Of course, we notice that there's a difference between household income, 1,000, and household spending, consumption spending, 650. That difference, of course, is the desired savings of 150, right? Obviously, so households brought that in, but it didn't get spent back out. And also the tax bill, both of which we call leakages for this reason, right? Because they're received by households as income, but not spent back out to businesses. This represents, of course, a nominal value, right? And there's, of course, a real correspondent, right? That's the difference between the real things we created from our work and what we actually used up. If we were to look at this business side, right, there's a correspondent deficit right now of revenues to costs. And there's also a real surplus in the sense that the business has unsold inventory. Okay, now this is a story we've heard before, so it should be familiar at this point. Potentially speaking, these leakages are a source of difficulty because, of course, they're put this business in the business sector in this deficit style position. What we can do is we can, if business is willing to invest the amount of household savings, 150, right? And similarly, if the government maintains a neutral fiscal position, that is to say it spends exactly what it receives in taxes, 200, then we see that this is effectively balanced, right? We have 150 business investment. Okay, we've talked about that at great length, so I'm not going to go into that. But then we also have $200 flowing from government to businesses, making up that deficiency. Now, if it's hard to sort of picture this, just imagine, government buying another police car or building another mile of road. Right? If we sketch out all the expenditures by each sector, it ends up looking something like this. So households, government, and then business on the right. Households received $1,000 in income. They spent $650 just on stuff. That's what household consumption is. We learned about that in Chapter 6. They had to pay their taxes of $200. They desired to save $150, okay, and then they're in that position. Businesses on the right-hand side received $850 in income, $650 from households, $200 from from government. Their business expenses were $1,000. That's what they paid households. And they have this deficit and surplus position. Government in the middle received $200 in taxes, spent $200, okay, and is nominally neutral, but has created sidewalks for public use. Let's take this to the next level. Let's see how the model will react to changes, right? Now, when the government changes taxation or changes its expenditure with the intent of changing the macroeconomy, and let's change taxes to 100. So we're going to cut taxes in half. It's a big tax cut, okay? But we're going to, at the same time, we're also going to increase our federal spending, right? So we're going to raise that to 500. So we're going to cut taxes and we're going to raise spending. So we're going to run a deficit, right? What is the deficit? Well, 400. It's a long day. Okay, so how is this sort of going to affect this whole system, right? Well, here we see the results. Okay, if we solve everything out mathematically again, just using our model, and in a separate video, right, we can use our little Excel spreadsheet that I generated for you all, and that's available on the course page, right, to do this, right? Or you could create your own just based upon what we've said here and in other videos. We solve this out mathematically. We find that household incomes now become $1,700, up from $1,000, right? So we've stimulated household incomes. Households are spending more as a result. They used to be spending $650, now they're spending $1,050. The tax bill's been reduced, and their savings has increased as well. Government is in a deficit position. Okay, then we've got a financial sector there too, which recognize a little bit from the Excel model that we built. And we've got the business side here. And what you'll notice when you look at across all of these is it's still all balanced, right? So the household saving position, right, the nominal savings position is positive 550. The government's deficit position is 400. The business sector's deficit position, nominal, is 150. 400 plus 150 equals 550. So the household savings now is what? It's the quantity of business investment plus the government's deficit position. Okay, so now if you're thinking, oh my gosh, does this mean that federal deficits contribute to household assets? The answer is absolutely, right? Remember, everybody's liability is somebody else's assets. Federal government's liability is, in this little example here, household assets. To the penny. Okay? So now you may be thinking, well, wait a second, does that mean if the federal government reduces its total debt, that would likely reduce total household assets? Absolutely. Now you see why it's so hard to do that. Because everybody likes to reduce the government debt. It makes them feel good. But nobody likes to reduce household assets. Now remember way back from the beginning of this, and I talked about fixing recessions and changing the macroeconomy in the very first lecture. And I likened it to sort of losing weight, right? Okay, well, here we can kind of see it, right? That the solutions actually aren't that complicated. But they usually involve us doing things that we don't like. So now if this seems a little magical to you, right? So if you're thinking like, geez, I'm not buying it. Okay, well, here's the math of it, right? Okay, so it's really not complicated. Indeed, it's nothing more advanced than rudimentary algebra with a smidgen of rudimentary calculus involved. Okay, what we have here, or what we see, is that the change in y given our model, right, it can be expressed in this way. That is the change in t times the MPC, which we'll call C1, times 1 over 1 minus the MPC, again C1, plus the change in government spending, which was, I think it was 300, okay, times 1 over, again, 1 minus C1. So what is this doing in each case, right? Well, C1, of course, was how households reacted to changes in income. And what it was, so if we raised household income, how much more are they going to spend? Okay? This is the multiplier idea. Okay, now, when the government spent more, let's say again it bought that police car or whatever, well, that's incomes for Ford Motor Company, which they're then going to use to pay their employees, which then their employees, of course, are going to spend a portion of that too, which is going to create income for somebody else, which is going to create additional rounds of expenditures, and so on and so forth. Okay, now is it realistic to imply that the multiplier is going to be this high from this government spending? No, probably not. Our estimation of C1 in this model is probably overly optimistic. Okay, but again, when we talked about this way back in chapter 5 of the text, we talked about how we really needed to estimate things like C1. From this, you can kind of start to see where economists disagree, right? Because we can't really know exactly how people are going to react to this policy. We can say pretty reasonably they're going to spend more if they have more income, but exactly how much more is much harder to say. Now, as an informed, consumer of information, right, you could go back and you could look at the data and you could use the methods that we've already talked about to estimate those values yourself and come up with an opinion about whether this makes sense or not. That would be quite well informed. Okay, and so it's it's not that complicated, but it does take a little bit of time and effort and a little bit of understanding about how these pieces fit together. Here we have this sort of whole thing again, right, including a financial sector. So you might say, where did the extra government money come from? Okay, well, we can see the financial sector there, that the assets and liabilities of the banking sector using a banking balance sheet similar to what we did in the previous couple videos. The bank has issued a loan to businesses of $150. It's issued T-bills on the behalf of government to the tune of $400, which it has assets of $550, and it has $550 in demand deposits from who? From households. Okay, that's the household saving. Okay, one last thing quickly before I go is the idea of automatic stabilizers. Most government spending in sort of in our era, right, 2019, 2020, are through what's called automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers refer to policies where government spending automatically goes up in bad times and automatically goes down in good times. Similarly, taxes that automatically go up in good times and automatically go down in bad times. There's a lot of examples. I think right here is a couple examples. In this way, we've really engineered counter-cyclical spending into the economy. So when household spending starts falling off, government spending starts cranking up to do what? To make the sum of those expenditures stable to the business sector. Finally, to conclude then, does this mean then that more spending by the government or lower taxes by the government is always good for the economy? Does not. Okay, absolutely does not mean that. Okay, government spending or taxation policy should be considered like any other spending. Right, so whether you would spend or not, one would hope that people in general spend when it yields a good return for them. Right, and so the same goes with government. The government spending, is it spending on things that are going to boost everybody's productivity? Because of course that's going to lead to long-run economic growth. Or is it spending money on throwing a giant party for everybody? Because that's just going to lead to a bunch of people being hungover. So the amount really doesn't matter, right? I mean, it's not the amount. So if I spend $10,000 on boosting everybody's productivity, that's good spending. If I spend $10,000 on throwing a giant kegger, that's bad spending. Okay, so it's not the amount, it's what you spend it on that matters. Same goes for the public sector. What are we spending on as a society? What are we not spending on as a society? Are these things that are going to make us more productive, more functional individuals in society as we go forward, or not? So in this way, we can see that, like households, right, and businesses, we saw that spending is constrained not by dollars or amounts or anything like that. We're constrained by good ideas, right? Good ideas are scarce, they're rare, they're valuable. Okay, and that's really what our society is constrained by, and what our government is constrained by as well. If we have good ideas as a society, the government can always find the money, create the money to make that happen. But if as a society we spend on bad ideas, or just things that aren't really ideas at all, then we have a problem, right? We're creating things of no value. It's going to be destructive in the long run. Thanks very much for listening to this presentation. I'm sorry it's gone a little long, but I thought I'd leave you here with, sort of public return on investments. I said that's really what we should be looking at. And I chose these two examples of public murals because I don't think they're what people would normally think of when they think of public spending and return on investment. And so I wanted to show you that, again, it's really about ideas, and good ideas, right? So a lot of research has shown that when you make public spaces look nice, like these murals do, that people are more functional, that they commit fewer crimes, right? That they're more productive at work, so on and so forth. So when we think about sort of what has a public return on investment, we should really think as broadly as possible. It's not just about investing in such a way that junior learns a second language or something like that. Well, it's not a bad thing, right? That's a good thing, but it's not as narrow as that when we think about sort of what type of public sector activities, government sector activities and spendings can actually make our society more functional from an economic perspective. All right, thanks. I'll leave you there. Have a good day, everybody. See you again next time.